Right, then let's go on to some numbers now. The IMF is forecasting global economic growth of about 3.4% this year and 3.6% next year. Now, both, it should be pointed out, are higher than 2016's estimated growth of just 3.1%. That's the lowest since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Now, the fund thinks some larger emerging markets and low-income countries which were exceptionally stressed last year have now started to recover. And a big lift could actually be provided by the United States, China, Europe and Japan. The fund has increased its forecast for China and the US with expectations of lower tax rates and possibly higher infrastructure and defense spending under a Republican-controlled Congress and White House. However, the fund does warn that there's much greater uncertainty due to the risk of protectionist measures and retaliatory responses in global trade. Let's dig a little deeper into the details of those numbers. Lorna Shattuck joins me now live from New York. Lorna, exactly how much confidence, though, does the fund have in its forecast of Nigeria's economy growing by 0.8% this year and 2.3% next year, especially given how volatile oil prices were last year and the fact that violence in the Niger Delta has not been resolved?
That's right. Well, this report generally, in particular for emerging economies, does come with quite a few caveats from the IMF. It did say for emerging market economies there's a wide dispersion of possible outcomes in its projections for 2017, not least, of course, because of the uncertainty generally on the international markets because of the lack of knowledge and forewarning that we've had from the incoming US administration about its fiscal policies. That could potentially leave emerging markets quite vulnerable. Nigeria wouldn't necessarily be immune from that. But in addition, of course, there's been a sharp drop in commodity prices recently. That has affected emerging markets as well. That's led to a tightening of financial conditions. And in addition to that, as you mentioned, that fluctuation of oil prices has continued throughout the year. And of course, there are still concerns about a glut in supply, despite oil-producing countries recently reaching an agreement on some kind of cap in production. And indeed, oil prices were mentioned this time last year by Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, when she visited Nigeria, and she said that Nigerians should brace for harder times. That was when she was backing the government on its removal of the fuel subsidy. But this report from the IMF also did mention, as you say, those Boko Haram attacks in the north and the consequent disruptions to oil production. And it said that that's affecting the economy in various ways, not only in oil income, but also things like business investment and tourism and attracting investors to Nigeria. So certainly lots of caveats generally for emerging markets, but for Nigeria specifically as well.
Indeed. Still on Nigeria, what exactly is the fund's position on Nigeria's botched devaluation of its currency in June last year? Is it still prodding the authorities in Abuja to remove capital controls and let that currency really, truly float?
Well, yes, the fund has pointed out the challenges around foreign exchange in Nigeria and how that's pushed inflation so high. And also it has specifically said that the failures in the economy are down to what it called delayed and poorly managed policy adjustments. So it is very much pointing the finger at leadership here. And indeed, Jean Leon, who's the IMF representative in Nigeria, has also said that the exchange rate should be allowed to reflect market forces more and restrictions on access to foreign exchange should be removed. And the fund has also pointed out that foreign exchange rationing has adversely affected the ability of many corporations in Nigeria to service their debt, as well as spreading. It's also affected the economies of neighbouring countries like Chad and Benin as well. So certainly some negative remarks from the fund. And it has recommended that in order to try and build more economic resilience, Nigeria should make sure that it has more of a diverse export base so it can handle external shocks better, but also build large foreign exchange reserves during good economic times so it's prepared for more tough times like this. But it's also recommended, and again this is something that Christine Lagarde mentioned last year, strengthening the tax system because of course Nigeria does have the lowest VAT rate on the African continent, and they feel that Nigeria should broaden its tax base and draw from a wider set of sections in a wider variety of ways in order to strengthen its tax base more.
Indeed, we should point out Nigeria's VAT rate is about 5% compared to about anywhere between 16 and 20% elsewhere around the continent. One last question for you, Lorna. Regarding the twin problems of rising inequality in income and opportunity across the world, does the IMF have any specific policy recommendations to solve that, especially in terms of access to education?
Well, it's interesting. This does come really, I think, at a time when experts are saying there is a bit of a shift in thinking within the IMF in the aftermath of the Great Recession over the last few years or so, particularly given the rise in other countries of far right and far left political movements. They do want to focus more on the reduction of income inequality. So that is quite a buzzword for them. And generally, some research recently by IMF officials did make a strong argument for the link between income inequality and sort of more macroeconomic instability. So it's very much a hot topic for them because they say it can jeopardise progress in education. And when Christine Lagarde spoke last year in Nigeria, she said one reason for removing the fuel subsidy would be to allow the government to invest more in education specifically, as well as other things like health and housing. But Jean Leon, again the IMF representative in Nigeria, has said the emphasis should be on doing more with less. So tighten your belts, but make sure that the government invests more in things like education, as well as creating an environment to attract foreign investment, something which they feel would go a long way to ending or at least reducing income inequality. But another thing that's also mentioned, as it so often is in these international reports, is corruption. Again, something Christine Lagarde focused on and something that, of course, President Buhari was elected to try and tackle. The IMF has applauded certain schemes that have been put in place by President Buhari to try and tackle that, but they say more still needs to be done.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you for the update. That's Lorna Shaddick, of course, live in New York.